from the University of Notre Dame and who is the Associate Director for the Study of Spirituality and an Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Theology at St. Mary's College in Indiana. Today, Dr. Federer is going to speak to you about sexual trauma, the most unspeakable and horrible act perpetrated against a human being. In her now classic groundbreaking work, Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman, Herman tells us that trauma faces us with extreme human evil and extreme human vulnerability. And now, in her recently published groundbreaking work, Incarnating Grace, A Theology of Healing from Sexual Trauma, Dr. Julia Federer shows us that healing from such evil goes beyond psychological treatment to the need for a deeper spiritual, mystical healing for our hearts and our souls. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Federer.
Thank you. I might need to hold this, huh? That makes it a lot easier. Okay. Well, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you to Dr. Loris for inviting me and all the work that the Center for Catholic Studies has put into bringing me here, and to Josh, who I think might interrupt us in a few moments to give us some more power for the laptop, who's been working on our tech. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is drawn from my book, Incarnating Grace. So I have a picture of the cover up there, partly because it's just so beautiful. And I was just really pleased with Fordham for putting the work into designing it. So when I first started teaching theology to college students about 10 years ago, I discovered that students are most interested in questions that try to make sense of suffering. So they want to know, why have I experienced suffering? Or if I pray enough, will God protect me from suffering? Does God want us to suffer? Can suffering bring me closer to God? Sometimes I show my students a crafted bookmark, and here's a picture of it, that belonged to my mother in the early 1960s. And I found it lodged between the pages of an old prayer book that she passed down to me. This bookmark, as you can see, it's a small rectangle. It's actually quite small here. It looks enormous. But the cutout picture, there's a cutout picture of Jesus in the corner, if you can tell. And it reads, "Do not fear suffering, for by enduring it, you can increase my glory and repair the sins of the world." I think this sentiment still feels familiar to my students who were raised in Christian households more than 50 years later. And I think a lot about my mother, who held this bookmark as she prayed in a church pew in South Philadelphia, while at the same time she was being sexually abused in her own home. And when I think about that, I think that the Christian tradition has horribly failed. It's failed her and so many other survivors who somehow received the message that traumatic suffering is a vehicle for God's saving grace. Violence does not add to God's glory. So I wrote this book because I wanted to try to contribute something to the process of saving our often broken ways of talking about God and God's grace in the Christian tradition. And I do so by naming and condemning that which has fostered and normalized sexual violence in the Christian tradition. And I also try to spend some time unearthing liberating resources buried in the tradition for describing God's healing work and empowering our participation in this work of healing. So I am going to be talking about sexual violence, so if you feel like you need to take a break, feel free to walk outside, or that's totally fine to take care of yourself. Those who experience the horror of sexual violence know that violent sexual acts can feel like they push against the natural order. The sexual violation of the bodies of children and teens can seem to threaten what can feel like a basic human instinct to protect and nurture youth. And the coercion of adults against their will into sexual acts can feel like pushing against the natural beauty and easy joy of sexual coupling. This feeling of unnaturalness that can accompany sexual violence is in part what contemporary Christian theologians mean when they talk about extreme suffering as senseless. The suffering of sexual violence serves no higher purpose or greater human value. This kind of suffering pushes against all ways of making sense of the world as good and orderly. But it would not be accurate to describe acts of sexual violence as against the natural order if it would be to claim that these acts are exceptional or rare, because they're not. More than half of women, and almost 1 in 3 men in the United States describe themselves as having experienced sexual violence involving physical contact at some point in their lives. These are staggering numbers. And we know that sexual exploitation doesn't need to involve physical contact at all to be profoundly damaging to the victim. So we can think about stalking, or online forms of sexual harassment, and other forms of hands-off but very powerfully coercive forms of sexual exploitation. What we once thought of as uncommon, we now know to be quite ordinary. Sexual violence is a salient feature of our common life together. It's widespread in our schools and our churches and our homes. In the Christian tradition, the word salvation means the restoration of wholeness. And because sexual violence profoundly threatens human wholeness, healing from sexual trauma is a matter of human salvation. In Incarnating Grace, I argue that healing from sexual trauma is a mystical political practice. So that means that it's a process that's often lifelong, that involves the reparation of one's relationship with God and one's relationship with one's communities. And this mystical practice, this mystical political practice, is both incarnational and eschatological. So those are some big words that I'm going to unpack. By incarnational, by saying that healing is incarnational, I mean that healing, post-traumatic healing, is fully enfleshed and human. It is embodied, it's contextual, it's conditioned by history and circumstance, and by virtue of God's full embrace of human life and circumstance in the person of Jesus Christ, it's instilled with the Spirit. I'll return to this in a second. But I want to talk about what I mean by eschatological. By talking about healing as eschatological, I mean that it's partial and incomplete. It requires assistance from God, and it's insufficient on its own terms, but not desperately or depressingly so. In the Christian tradition, the incomplete and failing state of things is not the final word. And because the Christian story is the story of persistence of relationship in the face of violence, that's the story of the crucifixion, this tradition contains rich resources to animate the mystical political shape of post-traumatic healing. I think ultimately that the fullness of post-traumatic healing that's required must draw from resources that are deeper than that which can be articulated by the secular field of psychology alone. Healing requires eschatological hope. By that I mean hope that is grounded in the genuine expectation of God's creative transformation of human life and our free, creative, and courageous cooperation with God in bringing this transformation about. To return back to this idea that healing is incarnational, I mean that healing is the kind of healing that we require is deeply incarnational. Sexual violence harms our bodies, and our bodies are personal, right? My body is myself. But our bodies are also interpersonal. That's how I relate to you, is through my body, and I relate to you through your body. They're social, and our bodies are political, too. They have political markers. The context in which I'm in shapes my body and how I interpret it, and the ways that I care for and cultivate my body, and the way that I and others interpret my body and make meaning with my body, and what happens to my body outside of my control. So our bodies are never just individual or communal or corporate. They're always both at once. And the traumatic wounds of sexual violence affect every area of human being: the personal, the interpersonal, the social, political, the psychological, the spiritual, and so they're bodily in this fullest sense. And so salvation, if it has anything to do with post-traumatic healing, must involve the restoration of this fullest sense of the body. In the book, I return again to this refrain, God does not want human beings to suffer. And this might sound like an obvious statement to make, but I found that there's a common Christian tendency to rationalize suffering, to explain it away. Nancy Nason-Clark is a sociologist who studies Christian responses to sexual violence, and she argues that Christians tend to offer two different kinds of rationalizations or explanations about sexual violence to try to explain it away: individual-centered rationalizations and God-centered rationalizations. So an individual-centered rationalization is the first approach. And in this, Christians assume that grave suffering is the consequence of bad personal choices. So if you this assumes, okay, if I make good choices and live a good life, I will be free from major suffering throughout my life. So admittedly, good people might suffer from small inconveniences like the suffering of unrequited love, or the suffering of limited professional failures, or the suffering of waiting in line, or whatever like that, okay? But those who hold this position assume that good behavior protects one from the most significant forms of suffering, like interpersonal violence or early death. When assumptions about suffering are interpreted in the context of sexual violence, survivors can deduce that their experience of rape is evidence that they had somewhere in their lives previously had made a bad choice. And that rape is the natural or perhaps even cosmic consequence of that choice. Like I went out at night by myself, or I drank alcohol, or whatever, right? I wore a certain piece of clothing. This interpretation of rape can give the victim a sense of comfort to the degree that it can suggest that she's capable of controlling that which happens to her, right? Namely, if I make the right choices moving forward, this won't happen again. But ultimately, it carries more risks than benefits. It communicates that rape is the victim's fault. It obfuscates the culpability of the perpetrator, perhaps even deifying him as an agent of God's justice. And it hides the social and structural factors that make sexual violence a common experience. And furthermore, it's simply not true that good personal moral choices ensure that individuals will be protected from violence. And to suggest this to a victim who's struggling to survive may set her up for failure, catastrophic disappointment, and re-traumatization. So the second kind of rationalization is what Nason-Clark calls God-centered rationalization, and it's related. So this kind of interpretation of suffering is that suffering is allowed by God for reasons that are temporarily hidden to the sufferer, but ultimately at the service of some greater good. Right? So this is kind of like that everything happens for a reason idea. In this interpretation, Jesus' death on the cross is willed by God so that human beings can experience forgiveness for their sins. And it's often, this kind of death on the cross is often offered as a paradigm for suffering that's desired by God for reasons that are temporarily mysterious. Many who offer God-centered rationalizations suggest everything happens for a reason, but we might not know what those reasons are, right? When this kind of interpretation of suffering is applied in a context of sexual violence, it might feel comforting for some of the same reasons that individual-centered explanations are. It suggests that however chaotic and unjust a violent attack might feel, that someone, in fact, actually is in control somewhere, right? But again, the risks in this kind of approach outweigh any potential comfort that it may bring to victims, I think. It portrays God, so some of the risks are it portrays God as someone who desires the suffering of human beings. It acculturates vulnerable people to abuse, makes them feel used to it and as if they deserve that. And it fails to create sufficient space to condemn interpersonal and social political harm as sinful. And it minimizes victims' genuine pain. So theologians Joanne Carlson Brown and Rebecca Parker have argued that the image of Christ as suffering in obedience to the Father's will is one in which, quote, divine child abuse is paraded as salvific, and the child who suffers without even raising a voice is lauded as the hope of the world, end quote. When Jesus' death is portrayed as both authentically excruciating and somehow for a meaningful end, those who have suffered abuse find it difficult to understand their own suffering as worthy of protest, and may think that whatever they bear pales in comparison to the virtuous pain endured by Jesus. This understanding of suffering as fuel for growth is deadly for those who are suffering from sexual violence. Sexual violence does not produce any good in victims. It's senseless suffering that has no structural place in the divine plan. Rape does not have any hidden benefit for victims. There's no divine reason for rape. There's no ultimate meaning in rape. It is human sin. It is tragedy in an ultimate sense. So how can we think theologically then about sexual violence if there isn't some hidden meaning in it from God? Well, I think that there are some resources that we have in our tradition to make sense of God's healing work in our lives and beyond our earthly lives. And I draw some resources from Teresa of Avila, who's a 16th century Spanish mystic who critiqued her own society's obsession with honor and class distinction. And I think that she can offer us a generative starting point for a mystical political theology of healing. She had a spiritual vision of the embodied human person as the image of God and a friend of God. So we are made in the image of God, and we are made to be friends with God. And Teresa doesn't just offer the survivor a mystical vision of post-traumatic healing, but she also had a vision of social and political healing. She set up houses around Spain that transformed her own culture's patriarchal exchange of women's bodies as object into networked communities of female friendship and mutual care. So these were small houses that women could live in to be friends with each other and to experience friendship with God, where they weren't under control by local male authorities. Teresa's understanding of the human person as the imago Dei, as created in the image of God, clearly names the human person as possessing an inherent beauty that, on the one hand, should be preserved and held sacred by caring for it, by caring for this beauty, but yet, on the other hand, can't be destroyed by maltreatment from other people. Because the human person is fully embodied, union with God represents the fullness of bodily integration. So when you're united with God, you're even more fully embodied than otherwise. This is a bodily union with God. It's not just a transcendence of the body. And care for bodies, your own body and vulnerable people, other people's bodies, is integral to fidelity to God. I think these are really helpful starting points from Teresa. But yet, for all the ways in which Teresa is helpful in constructing a theology of healing from sexual violence, she also has her limits. Sometimes Teresa can suggest that experiences of suffering present opportunities to serve God. That sounds familiar, right? It kind of sounds like those God-centered rationalizations a little bit. It can suggest that God desires human suffering. And so in the context of sexual violence, no suggestion could be more damaging to survivors. And so I think that Teresa's thought needs the correction of some contemporary theologians who have thought carefully about the absurdity of evil. So I think one person who does that well is a theologian named Edward Schillebeeckx. Edward Schillebeeckx was a 20th century Catholic Flemish priest who was influential at Vatican II. And he talks about human experiences of senseless suffering. And Schillebeeckx says that if God is worthy of worship, if we have a God who's actually worthy of being worshiped, that God would not want us to suffer and would never use suffering as a tool to bring about human salvation. So God's not just disclosed in the crosses of our experience, but God's disclosed as beside the cross, watching on as an indignant witness to our suffering. God's not behind abuse, animating it, but God's not above abuse either, indifferent to it. Instead, God is closely present to the victim survivor, making known to her all of the ways in which her experiences miss the mark of full human dignity. In the last two chapters of the book, I talk about two Christian virtues that I think can animate post-traumatic healing: courage and hope. So I want to talk first about courage. Courage is a word for describing the habit of persisting in the work of healing, however arduous or hard healing might become. So it's about persistence. Healing from sexual violence is a long and difficult process that often takes a lifetime. And many trauma psychologists, so secular theorists, have noted the importance of courage in the long-term work of post-traumatic recovery. Secular trauma theorists recognize that healing relies upon courageous action taken by survivors, empowered by a hope for the future to pursue healing. And in the context of sexual violence, courage is a commitment to healing, however long and difficult this process might become. And I think that we can turn to Jesus as a model of this kind of courage. Jesus not as a model of somebody who was a willing, suffering servant, but one who resisted the violence of the Roman Empire and assigned his own meaning to his life and his work. I just want to talk a little bit more about hope. And hope is a habit, too. It's a habit of reaching out toward a healed future with the genuine expectation that by working together with God, this healed future is possible. So we often talk about hoping for something in the context of sexual healing from sexual violence. You're hoping for a future in which you can experience healing, right? The fullness of healing. I want to talk a little bit more about hope, though, and talk about what hope means and what it doesn't mean. I end the book by talking about hope, but really the whole book is really about hope. Secular trauma researchers, psychologists, and psychiatrists tell us that traumatic healing doesn't just consist in returning to some pre-traumatized way of living. It's not about erasing and pretending as if this thing had never happened to you. Healing after trauma looks like the ability to choose to focus on traumatic memories when desired, and not being unintentionally overwhelmed by traumatic memories without any sense of control over where and when this might happen. So healing looks like being able to manage traumatic memories, but not erasing them. Trauma affects our whole selves, but the primary site of traumatic woundedness is our capacity for relationship. That's the primary site. So as Dr. Loris talked about, Judith Herman at the very beginning of this, she says that the primary site of woundedness is our relationships when we're sexually violated. And I don't just mean our romantic or our sexual relationships, but it could involve that. But I also mean our relationships with ourselves, our relationship with God, our relationship with our friends and our family and our broader community. Those are the sites of woundedness. So traumatic healing, then, is the capacity to restore the capacity for relationships. The person who has experienced post-traumatic healing has not arrived at a state in which all of our relationships are not affected by our traumatic past, but it's that we have, again, relational functionality. We're able to form and sustain relationships in spite of the ongoing challenges that our traumatic histories present. That's what I'm talking about. And so hope is that we can transform our traumatic pain, not erase it. Despite survivors' strong desire that the pain of trauma disappear over time, right? We hope for an erasure. A lot of times we hope that that can be the case. Trauma researchers document that survivors' traumatic pain remains, but often we can experience a transformation of that pain. One study that attempted to quantify this sentiment found, as sociologist Catherine Cameron says, overwhelmingly 92% of respondents were convinced that the past abuse lost its power in their lives rather than disappearing completely. So we're talking about pain losing its power, not being erased. Those who had the strongest desires for the erasure of their traumatic past through therapeutic interventions found therapy lacking. They were disappointed. Psychological treatment doesn't erase traumatic memories or reinstate the confidence that the world is a safe place. Traumatic therapeutic efforts can often increase patients' pain before it can help them to manage pain effectively. So I'm going to quote from Cameron again, the sociologist who tried to quantify some of this. She says, the flaw in their expectations lay in the belief that life was going to change. It was going to become much kinder to them. That there would be changes in their outward existence, and the world would be a better place. However, in some ways, the world, or certainly their view of it, became worse. They discovered evil in men and women that they had never conceived possible in the process of understanding their own background and the experiences of others like them. They recognized events in the lives of little children that were nearly incomprehensible. And yet they had to acknowledge that these things not only happened to other children, but had happened to themselves. They learned about human depravity. So we often find, like, as we're moving through a process of healing and we remember things that have happened to us, we confront our past, things often feel worse before they feel better because you're confronting truth, right? Erasure of traumatic pain is not the goal of traumatic healing. An expectation that traumatic pain can be erased at all, fails to do justice to the gravity of the original acts of violence. Cameron quotes a study participant, Norma, who says, "Will we ever get over it? The question itself is an insult. It diminishes the wrong that was done to us and the achievements that we have made in working it through. We are forever changed, but we have turned that change into a positive." So I think that when we talk about traumatic recovery, we need to respect the harm that has been done and aim to transform that pain into reserves of resistance to evil and conversion of the world. So this sentiment that pain can't be erased but transformed sometimes propels some trauma researchers to make a terminological distinction between recovery and healing. So some people say, some trauma researchers want to make the argument that recovery is possible, but healing is not possible. By eschewing the term healing, by saying healing is not a good word for us to use, what they're trying to do is to avoid the idea that if we have enough therapeutic treatment, survivors can be cured of the wounds of violence. So by saying that we shouldn't really think about the word healing anymore, we should talk more in terms of recovery, they're trying to avoid the idea that we can be cured of traumatic pain. We found that a false sense of hope, hoping for erasure of pain, that's animated by unrealistic expectations, can be paralyzing over time. And the language of healing can often create unrealistic expectations, thinking that we have the kind of progressive trajectory that culminates in being cured. But some trauma researchers say recovery language, instead, can more clearly communicate the messy nature of post-traumatic care that culminates in not erasure, but transformation of traumatic experience. So one survivor explains it this way. "When I first came into treatment, I thought, okay, I'm going to work really hard on this, and in a year's time, it's going to be wrapped up in a package with a bow on top, and I can go on with life. And when it didn't, I fell into the pits of despair." So some trauma researchers claiming that recovery language, if we talk about recovery and not healing, we can more clearly indicate the ongoing nature of post-traumatic efforts towards wholeness. Here's my response to that debate. I think that in a Christian context, we can reclaim the idea of healing if it is heard in an eschatological key, in an eschatological register. By that, I mean that we can have, in a Christian language, we can have an attention to the awareness that comprehensive healing is not yet complete. Healing, so I have this dash here, can be reclaimed as a present progressive verb, its ongoing process, if it's spoken in an eschatological key. So in the Christian tradition, we believe that healing, that salvation has begun but is not yet complete. To insist simply that healing is not possible forecloses, I think in a negative way, it forecloses the imaginative space to envision a fully redeemed human life. And I think we risk an idolatrous vision of God that's hemmed in by unnecessary limitation. If we So I think there's two dangers, right? We could, in line with popular Christian narratives of healing, promote an unrealistic vision of healing in which we have this linearly progressive view of healing that results in erasure of pain, right? We're going to get better over time just by working hard enough. If we have that kind of idea, we risk disappointment, we risk paralysis, and we risk a truncated view of the human person. But on the other hand, if we just give up the whole idea of healing, I think we risk the invitation by God to envision and imagine what a fully redeemed human life could look like and the ways in which we can participate in bringing that about with God's help. So I think eschatological hope, a kind of hope for that salvation, the process of healing has begun but is not yet complete, and we can participate in this process of healing, is a language that's capable of, we can take this language from the Christian tradition, and it's capable of sober recognition of human life for what it is. Damaged by human sin, yet able to be healed in cooperation with God. And I think the fullness of post-traumatic recovery requires an eschatological imagination. The fullness of post-traumatic healing requires reserves that are deeper than that which can be articulated by the secular field of psychology alone. It requires hope, solidly grounded in the genuine expectation that transformation is possible through God's creative work and our free, courageous, and creative cooperation. Hope sustains survivors and their allies in imagining the impossible. Hope gives us the energy that we need to hold on in the long and slow work of personal, interpersonal, and social political recovery. And I think because hope in our contemporary language has been evacuated of so much meaning, it often stands in just now for kind of an optimistic feeling or a wish. I think it's important to be specific about what I mean. By hope, I mean Christian eschatological hope. It's this tension between the already and the not yet that's carved out by eschatological hope that we can speak adequately about post-traumatic healing. So there's much that's within our reach, but the fullness of healing still runs out ahead of us. So eschatological hope is fueled by the faith that good must have the last word, and efforts toward post-traumatic healing empowered by eschatological hope are courageous, but also self-consciously provisional. So if we have this idea that salvation has begun, but is not yet complete, we know that what we've done, everything that we can do to participate in salvation is important, but we don't save ourselves. So we try to cooperate with God in bringing about whatever good that we can, but it doesn't rest only on our shoulders. A Christian kind of hope allows us to be critically negative. It allows us to be perpetually discontent with the world, but still perpetually committed to its good. This kind of hope commissions the Christian to transform in imaginative ways what is into what should be, and converts the basic human impulse to imagine and expect into a responsibility to resist and create. And I think really what it helps us to do is to imagine the dismantling of rape culture. So this idea in our culture that we should expect a rapist around every corner, that it normalizes sexual violence of vulnerable people. Christian hope can provide a language to empower courageous activity undertaken towards healing that authentically expects something new, but also grounded in realistic understanding of our human capacities. So, what does that look like? I think it allows us, when we have a Christian vision of hope, it allows us to celebrate and small ways in which we dismantle expectations about sexual violence, right? We can celebrate and participate in works like trying to extend statutes of limitation for prosecuting sexual crimes against minors. But we can still hold on to this far-flung vision of a world in which prosecution guidelines might never be necessary because nobody would ever do that to someone else. Does that make sense? I want to close actually by reflecting again on my mother. Here's a picture of her from when she was a little girl. I write about her in my book, and as a teenager, she was assaulted by a family member in her bedroom, and she carried that memory with her the rest of her life. And as an adult, she placed small bells, so here's a picture of these bells, on her bedroom doorknob so that when anybody opened her door, she could hear the bells ringing so she wouldn't be surprised. And I think these bells were a sign of hope, actually, a hope that she had for a life of safety, a life in which she might be able, with time and God's assistance, to sleep soundly at night. These were the kind of conditions that she needed, these bells on her door, to create healing for herself as a present progressive activity, something that was ongoing healing. And they were a sign of hope for herself, a sign of reverence for her past and for her wounds, and an honesty about her needs as she persisted in trying to be open to relationships with others. So to this point, as kids, she never told us not to come into her bedroom at night if we needed her. But if we did, the bells rang quietly so that she wouldn't be afraid. So I lost my mom this January very suddenly and unexpectedly. And on the night of her funeral, the only available spot for me to sleep was actually in her bedroom. And right before I went to sleep, I stood at the threshold of her room and I took the bells off of her door knob. And I took them home with me. But as I did that, I prayed a prayer that she might finally be able to experience a deeper form of rest, a deeper and more complete form of healing, where she didn't need any more signals for danger. And so I took these bells home and I put them above my writing desk on this poster that the publisher gave me of my book cover. And she was so happy about the book, so she would have loved that. And I think they're now a sign of my own hope, my own eschatological hope, these bells, that, that there are still forms of healing that run out ahead of us. There are still things that are not yet healed, but we're in the process of being healed. And I hope for the day that Christians can stop talking about traumatic suffering as a vehicle for God's saving grace. And I hope that we can talk about God's grace as operating in and through the process of healing from everything that wounds us. These processes are both mystical and political, since they draw us closer to God and they transform our collective lives. When we have yet to experience the full freedom of post-traumatic healing, full freedom from the grip of rape culture. But we wait for this transformation in hope, and while we wait, we mourn, and we protest, and we imagine what a new future might look like with courage in our hearts. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much
Yeah.
for inspiring and enlightening and bringing us to new ways to think about healing for sexual trauma. I want to begin, I have questions, but I want to see if some of the students, I recognize some of the students in the class, in the audience here. If you have comments, questions, don't be afraid. This is a safe place. So do you want to make a comment? Do you have a question? What'd you think about what Dr. Federer said way back in the beginning when she said sometimes it gives control to a victim of sexual violence if they're thinking, well, maybe if I wore different clothing, or if I didn't take that drink, or maybe if I didn't kiss him? What'd you think about that sentence? I'm going to throw this at you.
I think these.
I do see the control aspect of it, where like being sexually assaulted is so out of our control that having that slight idea, like maybe if I do this, I can prevent it. But like she said, like at the end of the day, it's not your fault, and you aren't the reason that happened.
But you know that women were blamed for that, and still sometimes are. What about the idea that, you know, and that is one of the most powerful things in my treatment of survivors. I start off explaining to them, you know, they'll be talking to me about thinking about erasure. You know, and so in the right way, an appropriate way to explain to them, we will never take away the memory. What we will do is, you know, heal you to be able to control that in some way, to manage that. So what do you think about that? You'd never take away that memory, which means the experience is always there. So then, can you be healed? Okay. All right, come on. Thank you so much.
Of course. I think it kind of, I'm trying to think what I want to say.
We're filmed, so you need to stay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I feel so bad about that. Okay, I'm here now. I think it's just like a way of like people just trying to like rationalize it, and I'm trying to think more about what I want to say. Can you like repeat the question just one more time, just so I can think a
The
little bit
memory
more?
will always be there.
Yeah, I think it's
So
like,
you can't take away the memory.
I think it's like in our subconscious to be there, and like every time that like even if like we're in a safe environment, like it's ingrained in our head that like I thought I was in a safe environment in the first place, and then that happened, so now it's so much in their subconscious that they don't trust anybody again because that trust has been completely diminished, and it takes time to like build trust again if you do.
Good. Thank you. Yeah, hold on.
I have lately been reading about theologians re-imaging the idea of Jesus died on the cross for our sins, saved us from our sins. And there is another school of theology, a Franciscan one, that says, no, Jesus became one of us. God sent Jesus to one of us to show us how incredibly loved we were. Not because Jesus had to suffer for our sins, and God put him through the crucifixion because someone had to make up for the terrible sins of humankind. And I think that reinforces the whole idea of an abusive God. You know, I'm going to punish you for the sins you've committed by putting you through the cross, where other theologians are saying, no, Jesus died because he was a human being. And if you're human, you're born and you die. That's part of being human. It wasn't connected to our sinfulness, which became the way we think about things. So I think that some things you've suggested go back to a deeper imaging of God as punisher.
Well, I think, yeah, I appreciate that comment a lot. Um, I think I would say, yeah, that's the kind of way that I'm trying to think about Jesus, that Jesus didn't die as to somehow make up for our sinfulness and as an atonement, but instead that Jesus, but in a different way, Jesus did die because of sin, right? Jesus died because he lived in a sinfully violent world in which he became a casualty of that sinful violence. And so many people are casualties of that kind of sinful violence for reasons that they never chose to be. And that a lot of times that kind of violence doesn't have any kind of rationality to it. People aren't selected for any particular reason. They happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I think that kind of way of thinking about violence is particularly important for survivors to remember that many survivors were not selected for a reason. It's about accidents of history, that we were people who were accessible, who were there, who, became the object of other people's sinfulness and wrongdoing. And so what I think is meaningful about God's reaction to that violence is that God does not allow the story to end there with meaningless suffering, that Jesus' death is not the last word. That's not the end of the story. The story ends with God's resistance to that act of sinful violence with the resurrection. So God did not abandon Jesus in his death, but God raised him after that.
Dr. Fetter, I just want to say, as a fellow theologian, this just gave me so much, just the joy you get from thinking theologically about things, so thank you for that. I found your talk to be just wonderfully rich. This is kind of something that I've been thinking about for a very long time, God's role in the suffering of the crucifixion specifically. And I was thinking, up there on the screen, you were referring to the God-centered rationalization and sort of rejecting that. And it seemed like it said, if God does not allow for the suffering, even if it's for something good, right? And so I guess my question, though, is there a distinction we want to make between God allowing the suffering to occur and God desiring that suffering? Mm-hmm. Because at the end of the day, I do hear you. God didn't abandon Jesus on the cross, but the cross still happened.
Yeah.
So God did allow it to happen.
Right.
And that's, for me, is the terrifying thought, how to make sense of that. But I'm wondering if you have any reflections on that.
Yeah, I think that, God does not will human suffering, is how I put it, because that's how Edward Scalabex puts it. And what by that he means, and I mean, that God does not want human suffering to happen. But God doesn't step in and, at the last second and snatch us out of a dangerous situation. And God didn't do that for Jesus either. And I think, we can talk about why that's the case, God respecting our own finitude and free choices, but I admit that that kind of conversation falls flat, because it's like, well, what about the survivors' free choices? You know what I mean? I mean, this is a tragedy. I mean, this is a tragedy of human life.
That's kind of what, so just to put what you asked in the context of a sexual assault survivor, I was asked once, they happen to be Catholic, right? So how could God allow the evil that happened to me happen? Yeah. That's really You know, that's the suffering you're talking about. You know, if God is powerful, why didn't God stop that, right? And giving them talk about free will and that kind of thing is not going to help them when they're in that kind of inexorable pain. But to your point that, you know, God doesn't will it, but why does God allow it is the question that survives. Why me? Why did God allow this evil to happen to me?
I think it's precisely these kinds of questions that make me want to turn to an eschatological vision of salvation. So by that I mean, as I was going through this talk, I was like, I should have explained what that was a little bit earlier. But, you know, by eschatological vision of salvation, I just mean the idea for Christians. Christians do not believe that we've been saved and it's over and it's done. They believe that salvation is a process that's happening in history, and part of it's already complete, and part of it's not yet complete, right? So the incarnation has happened, God has become present and embodied in human life and enfleshed, but the story is not yet over. We still haven't experienced the full redemption of all of creation. And I think that's true for human life too. We haven't yet experienced the full eradication of evil. And we are promised that. We actually are promised the full eradication of evil. And yet we don't see it anywhere, right? Where is it? And so I think that cry from a survivor, like, why did this happen, is the cry of humanity. You know, why are we still broken? Why is salvation not yet complete? Why is the Christian tradition talking about wholeness? And where is this wholeness? I haven't experienced it. You haven't experienced it. In little glimmers and hints, yes. But the full wholeness of human life has not yet been experienced. It's still on the way. And I think we have this desire, we have this sense that what we experience now falls short. And so that question from the survivor, like, why did this happen to me? I think that kind of question itself is a miracle, even to ask that, because it shows a kind of an expectation that I deserve something better than that, you know? Like, that we would even balk at something if we've been so degraded and abused is itself a miracle, I think. And it shows that we have a desire for something more, and we know that we were created for something more than that, and that we can expect something more moving forward. And we might not experience that in our lifetimes, but we desire something more for ourselves and for humanity. And I think that discontent, that disappointment is a holy disappointment. It's a sacred disappointment. And that's a desire that's given to us by God, who wants us to notice that salvation is not yet complete. This wholeness is not yet complete.
Thank you so much for today. Thank you. If some of you want to stay here.